What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another live stream with Gizmo Slip Tech. Looks like we're live and we're good to go. Today, we're going to be taking a look at side-by-side split screen footage of Hogwarts, Cyberpunk 2077, and what's the last one? The Witcher 3. So we're going to take a look at these three games. I captured this footage in ultra slow motion at 240 frames per second, and it is a 240 hertz refresh rate display as well, though we're not rendering at 240 hertz, but we're going to get the full, all of the fake frames will be captured in this live stream. So we're gonna be able to analyze those, look for artifacting, look for visual glitches, and I'm gonna let this play as I'm live streaming. Hopefully we don't run into any problems with the smoothness of this live stream, but we're going to try to answer a lot of questions today that I think is just going to be very interesting to try to investigate. Like, what are the downsides of frame generation? We're going to talk about 5 downsides of frame generation, when you should use it, when you shouldn't use it. What are the upsides to frame generation? And my experience in using it so far. So it's going to be a really interesting, I think, topic and question, because this is the arguably #1 feature that NVIDIA is trying to push with the RTX 4000 series laptops, right? If you're debating between getting an RTX 3060 and a 4060, or an RTX 3070 Ti and an RTX 4070, knowing whether or not frame generation is actually worth your time and money, your hard-earned money, is one of the biggest questions. And so today we're going to be looking at side-by-side slow motion footage that I captured with my slow motion camera pointed at the laptop display. Okay, so this is not captured inside of the game engine or game mode. This is straight from the laptop display, and it should be a pretty good representation of this footage. It's not going to be quite as high a bit rate as what you'd get when you were capturing the onboard camera or like with the in-game engine footage, but oftentimes those in-game capture engines can only go up to 60 frames per second capture. So they're not capturing all of those extra frames, and especially the in-between fake frames. So using an external camera pointed at the laptop screen is going to allow us to get in there and look at all of those fake frames, the artificially generated frames. I call them fake frames, but they're basically artificially generated frames that are put in between the real frames. So let's talk a little bit more about frame generation. What is it? First of all, it is a integration of artificial technology, AI technology, and the Ada Lovelace GPU engine. And then what they're using is the motion vectors of the in-game engine combined with the most recently generated frame. And then they're basically creating artificial in-between frames. So there's a real frame, and then there's a artificial frame generation frame, and then there's another real frame. Now the real frames are being slightly delayed because of this insertion of the fake frame. So that is probably arguably the biggest downside. And the first #1 downside is that this increases latency. Overall system latency does go up. So let me go ahead and get the footage going side by side of me in these different games. And let me just also pull up chat on my phone so that way I can check out what you guys are saying at the same time. Because in order to do this, I have to have it be full screen so you guys can see the footage. But so let's just take a quick look at some of this side-by-side footage, and then we'll get back into some of the upsides and downsides. Notice on the left-hand side, that's the frame generation side. Notice the much higher FPS. We're doing 118 FPS, 119 FPS, 122, and the average is also much higher, though the average was not didn't reset right at the beginning of this run, so I wouldn't look at that average number. Just look at the current FPS of 130 versus 71. So that's a 50 FPS bump going through the same area of Hogwarts, which is absolutely an insane amount of increased frames. And you can see those increased frames and how much smoother the cape is moving in this side-by-side clip. It is dramatic difference, at least for me visually seeing it. Uh, it's pretty crazy. All right, so Double David says, does frame generation cause more heating? That's a great question. I mean, you can look at it side by side. We are getting a bit more watts going through the GPU on the frame generation GPU, about 5 to 10 more watts, maybe 15 more watts going through there. And it is utilizing some of the Ada Lovelace architecture to run this frame generation. So in some senses, it makes sense that it's going to use a little bit more wattage, but it's not a severe overhead being added to the GPU load. It's like 5 to 10 watts, it seems like on average. At least we'll see. We got to look at more of these games, but right now it's 137. And then for the other side, wow, it's only 53 right there, but 140. So it's about 5 to 10, 15 watts more on the GPU that is using frame generation. And while this is playing side by side, I would invite you to look at the footage very carefully and look for any kinds of artifacts, glitches, errors in the way things are being rendered. In Hogwarts, it's very hard for me to notice anything that stands out as being a major problem. Even in slow motion, even during the slow motion breakdown, it's so interesting to me. So let me answer chat again. Do you think that NVIDIA will make frame generation available for the RTX 3000 series in the future? Not that I know of, because it's actually NVIDIA claims that this is a part of the new Ada architecture and that the older generations of GPUs are not capable of processing the frame generation frames, at least fast enough. Maybe they would be able to implement like a weaker version of frame generation in older generation GPUs. I don't know, but I don't think NVIDIA is financially or monetarily motivated to do that. They want people to buy the latest and greatest. So this section right here is a battle arena part of the Hogwarts where I'm going to be fighting a troll. And it's just, to me, it's incredible how much higher FPS I'm getting in this particular section. Over 100 FPS versus only like 65 to 70 something FPS. It's such a big difference. And you can see the motion on the left being just much smoother. And as you're playing the game, you can visually feel the difference with your eyes, see the difference. So I'm not saying frame generation is perfect at all. We're going to go over all those downsides here, but as this footage is playing, I'd invite you to look for artifacts, glitching. You're going to probably see some of it in this slow motion with the way the robe moves. The edges of the robe there on the left probably is messing up a little bit. Maybe some objects as they explode and go across the screen, you get some weird artifacting sometimes. But in a high refresh rate game, it can be very difficult to notice those kinds of smaller artifact differences when they're only on your screen for a millisecond or a few milliseconds. So, yeah. All right. So let's continue. What is the downsides of frame generation, and then we'll talk about what are the upsides to frame generation, okay? So the biggest downside, it's quite clearly a big downside, is the increased latency. And we're talking about a 20 to 30% increase to latency. If the original latency is, say, 50 milliseconds from click to pixel for the whole system, you might be bumping up the latency from 50 to maybe 62, 65, somewhere in that range. And so basically you're looking between 20 and 30% increased latency. In games like Hogwarts, that's not a big deal. Right? 20 to 30% latency is not a big deal. You're not aiming precisely. The spells go wherever the white highlight around the enemy is located. You don't have to aim for headshots super precisely and carefully. And really, what you're looking for is a smoother gameplay experience in Hogwarts. And frame generation does deliver on that front. In terms of latency, without frame generation, the latency is really good, obviously. And with frame generation, only adding like a 20 to 30% increase to the latency, you can still react in time to most of the things as long as you don't mess up. Like I mess up several times on both sides here, but the bigger difference, I think, when it comes to latency is when you're aiming down sights with Twitch shooter type of games like Cyberpunk 2077 or esports titles. This brings me to my second major downside is that basically competitive esports games already have really high frame rates. And there's basically no point to using frame generation in games where you already are getting likely over 200 FPS. So essentially what this means is that frame generation is a wasted feature if you're or a feature that you really shouldn't be that excited about if you're an esports player, because you would never use it in those games anyway. And that brings me to another point, that there's a very limited selection of titles that use DLSS3 with frame generation. So initially at launch, I believe it was about 15 games. NVIDIA has announced now that it'll be 35 games will be supporting frame generation. And I'm sure the list is going to grow rapidly given the users' adoption and enjoyment of the feature. I think it's been received fairly positively in most games, but it really depends on the game implementation, which brings me to my third downside of frame generation. And that's if frame generation is poorly implemented in a game, we may end up seeing more visual glitches or bugs. And also it depends on the type of game you're playing. If you're playing a game where there's often large flying objects that completely block the view of the camera that you're seeing through, frame generation and the AI engine has a hard time dealing with these large flying objects. So the interpolated frames between the real frame and the fake frame just ends up getting, glitched, basically. It only is there for a millisecond, but in games like Spider-Man or, I don't know, even in Hogwarts or whatever, when something comes flying at your face and like a boulder comes and just completely blocks the camera view, right as the boulder enters and leaves, you may end up with extra artificial glitches. So your mileage is just going to vary when it comes to frame generation in terms of artifacts. I don't personally think that frame generation in most games, these artifacts, I don't think they're deal breakers. I think most of the artifacts are pretty good, at least in these three games that I'm showing side by side here. There are some visual glitches, and I'll try to point some out here later when we start reviewing this footage together. But it's not super significant, I don't think. Like I think the artifacts are there the artifacts that do show up are there and then they're gone quickly enough that I just don't see it as such a huge, massive downside. And I don't know. It's interesting. I think the latency really is the biggest downside to this. And so you basically are going to be not using frame generation in anything where you're doing something competitive. You wouldn't want to use frame generation even in something like League of Legends or Dota 2. You would just want to purely use the in-game rendered frames because they're going to have a quicker response rate. And when you're competing against someone, if you have a faster response rate, you might be able to click to shoot them before they shoot you. And it literally could mean that you die or not. So that's why optimizing your latency is so important for these competitive games. So frame generation just is not going to be good for competitive esports titles of any type, really. But all of these single player games, even in Cyberpunk, I think you can still use frame generation if you want. It does make aiming a little bit more difficult. You'll see I've got some first-person shooter side-by-side moments, and I can tell that it's just like a little bit more of a delay. It's not that bad, but it's just barely noticeable inside of something like Cyberpunk. But the thing is, if you use frame generation, the actual gameplay is so much smoother that I feel like in single player games that when you're not competing, it's worth having the smoother gameplay with the frame generation. Right here, you can see we're getting 109 FPS in Cyberpunk versus 69 FPS without it. Obviously, the latency is increased with the frame generation side of things. But look at our 1% lows. Our 1% low is also 84 frames versus 54 frames. And that is that is a very noticeable visual improvement to fluidity and smoothness of the gameplay. And I do think that this is the kind of technology that's it's hard to show with 60 frames per second video. That's why I'm doing super slow motion for this comparison. Yeah, I just think that so many people are going to be able to enjoy their games better and better with frame generation, as long as it's not a competitive title for the most part. Some games will probably not really benefit from frame generation because of the nature of the type of game, like Spider-Man, where you're flying around buildings. There's so much geometry and fast-moving huge objects that frame generation just doesn't handle those huge fast-moving objects as smoothly or as well as you really ideally want it to. And that's why I think that when it comes to frame generation, the best types of games for frame generation are going to be like adventure games, RPG games, nothing competitive, but pretty much there's huge potentials for frame generation, but it's like 2/3 of the games, and it really depends on what kind of player you are. If all you play is competitive games, frame generation's not a feature you should focus on, and you should just look to get the most raw performance in the laptop that you're buying or whatever GPU you're buying, simply because that's what's going to make esports games better for you as a user or as a gamer. So yeah, I mean, those are the five big downsides to me. Increasing latency, not applicable to competitive esports type games. If the implementation is poor in that type of game, like Spider-Man, for example, you run into visual glitches or just spatially the glitches are a little more noticeable. But I think in the vast majority of games out there, frame generation artifacting is not that big a deal, and it'll still make the gameplay a better all-around experience. And yeah, so the last downside, I think, is that sometimes HUD items like labels and text can be glitched from frame generation. And I think this is primarily a dev optimization issue, and that in the future, these kinds of glitches and visual problems will become less and less of a problem as long as the devs are doing a good job. So that's kind of my primary takes or understanding of all of these downsides. Let me, before we move on to the upsides of frame generation, which I have delved into some of the upsides already, but before we move on, I'm going to go ahead and check chat and see what you guys are asking and talking about. I just wanted to get through those points first. Unknown Monkey said, would be nice to see latency displayed as well, since it's the main complaint about frame generation. That's a great point, Unknown Monkey. I did not pull that up on the display. I kind of wish I did. Maybe at a future point, I'll be able to do some side-by-side footage, especially if I compare some more games. But yeah, latency is definitely one of the primary issues when it comes to frame generation, for sure. What difference would there be in Apex Legends? I would not use frame generation for Apex Legends. If you're an Apex Legends player, then frame generation is essentially a non-starter type of feature, because what you want is the most frames per second, and you can already hit the peak optimal frames per second without frame generation. So by introducing frame generation and inserting artificial frames between the real frames, you would just increase your latency for no real benefit. Yeah, so that's why you typically would not really want to use frame gen in games like Apex Legends and competitive shooters. Najavid says, do you think that frame generation will be good enough with a 4050? There are so many good laptops now looking at a 4050, but don't know if it'll be a good for most games. I think it probably will be very beneficial. We're going to talk about some of these upsides, but one of the upsides is that when we were testing the MSI Katana 15 yesterday, we were playing Hogwarts Legacy, and we were doing 35 FPS without frame generation with everything on Ultra in Hogsmeade there. And we turned on frame generation and we bumped the frame rate up to 65 FPS. Now 35 had low 1% lows as well. And when we bumped up the frame rate with frame generation, our 1% lows came up, and the overall smoothness of the gameplay went from being unplayable to being just just smooth. It was great. So I really think that frame generation is going to help boost the RTX 4050, 4060, and 4070 to be able to use higher levels of settings in games and still be able to push high enough frame rates that it's going to take a game from being unenjoyable, like on the Katana 15 without frame generation, to being much more enjoyable with that frame generation. Now, we need to do more testing. So, like, for example, I've not tested a 4050 or 4060 yet, but on the 4070, like I said, it brought Hogwarts from being unplayable to playable. So yeah. How does frame generation affect lower spec GPUs to higher end GPUs? So the latency is, when you have higher frames per second, is automatically going to be like a lower gap. So when you're dealing with low FPS, say you're dealing with a 35 FPS like in Hogwarts, and then you add frame generation in there, 35 FPS is already going to be fairly low total system latency. And so when you add in a little bit extra latency, it's going to make the latency reactivity be a little bit worse even than that lower latency you had already. But I still think the increased gameplay fluidity and smoothness is still going to be worth it. Now, if you want to shoot for even higher FPS, like the Katana 15 does go up to 144 hertz on the display. So if you were to target 144 hertz, you would end up probably targeting like a non-frame generation FPS of like, say, 60 or 70 or 80. And then you turn on frame generation, and that should be bumping you up to that 120 to 144 FPS range. So that may be, to get to those kinds of frame rates with frame generation on, you're probably disabling RTX or ray tracing. You turn off ray tracing, you enable frame generation and DLSS on quality, or maybe even bump it down to like balanced or performance mode. And then you're probably going to be hitting those 144 FPS target that you're shooting for. Checking chat again. All right, so Typher says, when you compare a single player game at, say, 120 FPS with frame generation against 120 raw FPS, will they both look the same? So they're going to look very similar, but not quite the same, because there will be artifacting that you would, like, just looking at the side-by-side right now, right? On my, I can't tell whether I'm pointing right or left, but on the left side of the screen, the way you're looking at it, we've got frame generation enabled right now. And I can't see any visual problems or glitches. And I've looked at this footage now for several pass-throughs. I can't see any. In Hogwarts, I can't tell a difference between frame generation being enabled or not in terms of the artifacting. There's very few artifacting inside of Hogwarts. The frame generation implementation is very smooth and very high quality. But in games like there's a Formula One racing game. That game does have some artifacting with like the labels over the cars, or in Microsoft Flight Simulator, some of the HUD items can have glitching. And so those become a little bit more user noticeable, or noticeable by the user. And so it really depends on the game whether you're going to notice those artificial problems. And I think most of the actual games, when it's implemented properly, you're not going to really notice it. And it's just going to look and appear smoother. The biggest difference between a 120 frames per second with frame generation versus 120 raw frames per second is going to be the latency. It's just the latency difference is going to be noticeable to someone who is sensitive to latency in games. But the difference in latency is basically like, imagine you're going from a really high fast latency response rate computer to a slightly lower response rate computer that's still pretty good. So it's not like the experience becomes horrible. The experience is not that noticeably increased unless you're trying to compete. Like, because when you're trying to compete, you're trying to get every possible little edge, to cut out every possible response rate so you get the quickest possible response so you can kill your enemies, or you just outcompete them depending on the game. So yeah, I think that I think frame generation in single player games, non-competitive titles, is extremely beneficial. As long as it's implemented well in the game, it's going to be a fantastic experience that is truly going to improve the end user's gameplay and experience without them even necessarily realizing that the latency has gone up. Because I don't think the casual gamer, the typical gamer, is even going to be able to tell that the latency has increased. It's only going to be really latency sensitive people that are even going to be able to tell, and that's probably true for first person shooters as well. Like if you're a casual gamer, you probably won't even notice the latency increase in a game like Cyberpunk. Like I don't think so, at least in my experience. I can tell, but it's also not the kind of thing that makes it so it's crippling. Like the latency increase is not crippling in my opinion. It's there, but it's not awful. So yeah. And yeah, in Hogwarts, it doesn't quite double it, but it's pretty dang close. And sometimes it is doubling the FPS with frame generation. Basically, when frame generation is kicking off really high levels, it's crazy. It's like a 90% performance improvement in Hogwarts at times. Anywhere from I would say typical frame generation performance improvement can be from 50% to 100%. So I think let's talk about the upsides, the pros. Now we've gone back and forth, but I have some pros here I want to make clear. Okay, so some people have basically accused frame generation as being completely fake frames and that they're invalid and should not count. And I think this slow motion test makes it pretty clear that these fake frames are actually real frames that the eye can see. Like you can see left on the left and right side how much smoother this gameplay is for the frame generation side. Not only in the terms of numbers, but in terms of what the user actually ends up visually seeing during the gameplay. And I would encourage you, if you can, try it out. Try out frame generation on and off and see what you think. Like, let me know in the comments of this video later on. Am I crazy? I don't think I am. I think it's quite clear how much smoother and more fluid the game is in Hogwarts, especially with frame generation enabled, and that the visual artifacting is so minimal that the average user will literally never notice any artifacting at all. So yeah, at least in Hogwarts. That's not going to be true in every game. I think the average user may notice artifacting in games where the development team did not implement frame generation properly, and you end up, especially with text that might be glitchy, stuff like that. I'll point out some text that's a bit glitchy with frame generation here in The Witcher 3. So we'll go into that here in a little bit. Okay, so I would say frame generation excels in medium to slow-paced games, especially like role-playing games, adventure games, and simulators. So stuff like Flight Simulator. Aside from the heads-up display, Flight Simulator is not a fast twitch, high response rate type of a game at all. Hogwarts is kind of a fast response rate game, but you don't have to do any detailed aiming. So it's really not that big of a deal. And the response times that are required in a game like Hogwarts really aren't that instantaneous. You get like a solid quarter second, half second to be able to respond to stuff. So you can still the player can still adequately respond to what's happening on the display, even with a slight increase to the latency. Now, I would say the other major pro to frame generation is that games that are CPU bound, like I imagine if Far Cry 5, for example, ever gets implemented with frame generation, that's a very CPU bound game. And we're basically seeing very minimal increases to the frame rate in a game like Far Cry 5 because it's so CPU bound. But the moment you interject frame generation into a game like Far Cry 5, we're going to see that 50 to 90% bump up in frame rate. And it will actually be one way to massively increase the gaming performance in these CPU-bound games like Far Cry 5. So I don't know necessarily that they will go back and re-update Far Cry 5, but in the future, you know, as we get games that are CPU-bound, that are released, I think frame generation will be a key feature that will allow for massive gains to the perceived human frame rate. You know, so it's gonna be pretty impressive. Um, that said, it needs to be implemented properly. You know, that's the crux, I think, to frame generation. And it really comes down to devs. We've seen with DLSS and DLSS 2.0 that we've seen poor implementations of DLSS, and we've seen good implementations of DLSS where you can barely tell that it's on when it's on quality. And I think the same thing will be true of frame generation. Some games in the future will have frame generation that's just implemented so well, like Hogwarts, where it's an incredible experience that the average user will never know frame generation is even on. And it's just going to make the gameplay smoother. That's the only way they'll really know. I'm saying, like, from an artifacts perspective, they won't notice any negative downsides to it, and the latency won't be so big that they won't even tell that the latency is increased either. So no artifacts. The perceived latency is not really there, and so games like Hogwarts, frame generation is just a massive boon. Games like Cyberpunk 2077, it's a trade-off situation where the latency makes it a little bit harder to aim, but the smoothness still probably makes it worth adding. Or potentially you could also just lower the DLSS or lower your settings to get higher frame rates and still have better response rates. Some gamers are going to prefer that over using frame generation. So it's just going to depend on the individual user and how sensitive you are to that increased latency. And yeah, so I think probably arguably the biggest boon to frame generation is these low-end laptops that are going to be struggling to hit 60 frames per second in a lot of these high-end titles. Like the RTX 4050, 4060, and 4070 laptops, I think are perfect candidates for frame generation. In single-player titles like Hogwarts, they'll be able to, basically with frame generation, you're going to be able to play on ultra settings, most likely in those titles, maybe with ray tracing on or off, depending on the game and the settings and the resolution you're playing at. But when you factor in the frame generation aspect, the 4050, 4060 really is going to be a lot more attractive than, say, a 3050 or a 3050 Ti or a 3060. And depending on the type of gamer you are, I do think a 4070 is going to be more attractive than a 3070 Ti or a 3070 if you're a single player gamer, not if you're competitive esports, and not if you're really latency sensitive. Like if you're latency sensitive, then you play competitive games, I really think a 3070 or 3070 Ti may actually be a lot better bang for the buck for you as a gamer. So it really depends. If you're a single player gamer, then the new 4000 series definitely becomes way more attractive, I think. Will the latency get lower when it's optimized? That's a great question, and the answer is not really, because there is always going to be the insertion of the artificial frame in between the real frames, and that's the problem. That's where the latency comes from. It basically, that insertion of the artificial frame delays the next real frame from happening as fast. So as long as the artificial frames are coming in, then no matter what, there's always going to be that delay in increased latency as far as I can tell. Now, they might be able to improve the latency by making the AI being able to spit the frames out just a little bit faster. But I don't think it's ever going to go away entirely. I think this frame generation technology will always have some latency component to it. So, yeah. Tommy Pickle says, I would love to have a 4090 Ti in a laptop that has at least 128 gigs of RAM DDR5, but I just can't find one yet. So there's no 4090 Ti laptop GPU, Tommy. I'm sorry. Victor says, would you be able to make a video to compare different laptop speakers? Would love an easy way to compare gaming laptops to the MacBook Pro 16. Yeah, I'm actually planning on doing a speaker comparison in the future. So EB88 says, is a 4070 worth the extra cost or should I stick to a 4060? So if you have a hard price that you're shooting for, say $1,500, and you don't want to spend more than $1,500, then I think going for a 4060 may be worth it if you can get, say, a better display, maybe a better chassis, a better quality all-around laptop with a 4060 is better, I think, than, say, going for the Katana with a lower-end display, because the display really is important aspect of a laptop, right? So if you were trading off between a 4060 and a 4070, and the 4060 has the better display and other options, then I would go for the 4060. Now, if you can get everything with a great display and you're spending maybe $200, $300 more for the 4070, that's where we got to actually benchmark and test and see how much better the 4070 is versus the 4060, so we can get a better idea of the performance per dollar that the 4070 provides. So versus the 4060. And right now we don't have those in detailed numbers yet. We'll get them soon. I've got a 4060 laptop coming. I've got a 4050 laptop coming. So within the next few weeks, we'll be figuring all of those values out. So if you just wait and hang on here, we'll be able to give you, us reviewers will be able to give you better advice very soon. So Legion 7 i9 13900HX 4080, what's your opinion? It seems like pretty good value, bang for the buck, but there are some downsides to the Legion 7 Pro 7i this year that make it a little less attractive, like a plastic touchpad, lower quality RGB implementation, the switching from USB-C ports to USB-A ports. If you're okay with all of the downsides of this new generation of the Legion Pro 7i, and you just want to have a high-powered machine, that's a good bang for the buck. I think the Pro 7i is going to be a worthy laptop to buy still. So I think you could go with it, with the Legion Pro 7i. DDR7 going to fix latency and frame generation. I don't think anything's going to fix latency and frame generation as long as the artificial frames. The thing is about the latency is that the artificial frames are using not the true game engine to drive the frame. We are using motion vectors and some things from the game engine to make those frames, but if an enemy player or an enemy comes onto your screen, this new information is unlikely to be interpolated into the actual interpolated frame, the fake frame, the generated frame. That's not going to have that. So that's the key latency aspect to me, is that this new data that's coming in to the frames and out of the frames is just not going to be accessible on those. It's not going to be visually accessible in the frame generation frames. So right here, I'm about to point it out. I'm going to pause this here and play it. Did you see watch the text on the left side over here? This text pops up and it gets a little bit glitchy. This is an example of the glitchy text in frame generation. Did you see that right there? It was like, for a millisecond, it like showed half of the text. And that's, oh, there it did again. So right there, the frame generation comes in and then it comes out. You see that? And those little visual glitches are going to be very hard to see as a user, at least in The Witcher 3. Depending on the game, you may notice those little visual glitches more or less. If a game has a lot of labels and text that pop up, frame generation seems to struggle with those labels and text that are popping up and makes them a little bit wonky, like half of the label is displayed for like half of a frame and then it goes away. And those are the visual artifacts that are going to be most noticeable, not the actual graphics of the game. As far as I can tell, the actual visuals of the game seem so high quality to me with the frame generated frames. I look at it side by side and it's so hard for me to find any visual artifacts or glaring issues. I don't know, Chad, have you been able to find anything? I'm curious. Chris says, my laptop just died. I pre-ordered the Alienware 184080. Should I hold out for the 4090 or will the 4080 give me the power I need? I think the 4080 is probably going to give you a good bang for the buck. The 4090 is going to be more powerful, but you're probably going to pay a little bit of a premium to get that 4090, right? That's probably going to be $500–600 more, and it may not actually be that big of an improvement for the money. I don't know. We don't know exactly how much it's going to be. Alienware has not priced out the RTX 4090 version for us yet. I will be doing a hands-on live unboxing of the RTX 4080 Alienware M18, so you'll be able to, I guess we'll be able to find out its performance and its value together. Yeah. Wait out for the X18. I have not, has Alienware confirmed the Alienware X18 is even coming? I have not heard that it's even going to be coming, so I don't know. Wolf says, I want my Scar 18. I feel you, man. I feel you. What's a good... So, Najved asks, what's a good balance between good FPS in multiplayer and great FPS in single-player games? So, that's the thing about frame generation. Like, I did say that it's a big downside that you can't really play esports games with frame generation because of the increased latency. But the good thing is about those esports games is that they're already optimized for high levels of frames per second. Like, especially if you set those esports games to the low settings or the low side of settings, which is how I play esports games. I don't play esports games on max settings. Are you crazy? Even on my RTX 4090, I don't want any slowdowns to my FPS, my frames per second, my 1% lows. I want all of that to be as high as it can possibly be, so that I can react as quickly to the enemies that come onto my screen. And when you interject the frame generation, it's that's not good. That increases the latency. Now, what you're asking is what's a good balance between the FPS in multiplayer games and great FPS in single player games? Well, that's the nice thing, in my opinion, about these RTX 4000 series laptops. They're still good enough to hit over 200 FPS pretty much in every esports title, almost. Maybe not like Warzone 2. But aside from that, you can pretty much get over 200 FPS in Fortnite, Apex Legends, Valorant, CSGO, even with probably an RTX 4070, maybe even 4060 and 4050. We don't know yet, but esports games tend to be very optimized. So frame generation, we don't even need frame generation at all in those games. So there's probably, the devs probably will never even implement frame generation into games like Fortnite, because why would you? The players aren't going to want to use it. And unless frame generation just becomes very easy to implement, I don't see developers even trying to implement it. So my Blade 18 4080, 64 gig, 5200 megahertz RAM with 4 terabytes comes in on Monday. Congrats, man. I got my Blade 18 right here. Woo! And this footage that we are looking at up on the display is from the Blade 18. So let's take a look and watch the footage together and look for any artifacting. And let's also point out and look at any kind of wattages or GPU issues that we might be able to see. For right now, I just want to point out, you can see my mouse, right? So on the left-hand side, look at the wattage that the frame generation GPU is using. And it's almost always pulling 5 to 10 more watts, maybe 15 more watts in the frame-generated version of Hogwarts here. If I skip ahead, let's just kind of look here. Our frame rate being 70 without frame generation, 106 with frame generation. Look at how stuttery. I don't know if you guys can see how stuttery it is, but this to me is still very smooth on the left side. The gameplay is very smooth. On the right side, I can see the individual frames as they're being generated, and I can see those, like the stutteriness of it because we're in slow motion mode. If I skip ahead, let's go to the next game. Oh, hey, I'm seeing... I think I'm seeing just a little bit of artifacting. Do you see the cape right here? Some of the edges of the cape. But in full motion mode, I don't think the user is going to ever notice that. And I think we probably will get those kind of artifacting sometimes happening with this cape. But the artifacts just look a little bit more wonky with frame generation on this side, because the frame generation engine basically has to try to guess where the cape is going to move next. And so sometimes it ends up not quite guessing right, and you end up with like little artifacts where the cape was thinking, the engine was thinking the artifacts were going to go, but it didn't. So here in Cyberpunk, these averages are correct up here at the top right now. So 109 with frame generation, 67 without frame generation. And this right here just looks much more slideshowy, you know? Whereas this does not look as slideshowy. No, oh, look at the bottle. We can see some visual artifacting on the bottle right there. So look at these bottles. And then look at these bottles right here. Just a little bit of artifacting right here on the bottle. And I would say that is from frame generation. So that's kind of an example of a visual artifact. The chair legs there have just a little bit of artifacting. But when you're playing the game at full speed, it's kind of hard to notice those. Like I didn't notice those until I'm looking at it in slow motion. So hopefully we don't overheat too much. But I wanted to show you a couple other visual artifacts that I had noticed previously in Cyberpunk. But to me, the biggest difference here is the smoothness of everything. And all right, so you can hear me now. It's probably going to overheat again up there. Unfortunately, I want to show you this one thing before we end this live stream. There's one more thing I want to show you. So let me just hide this webcam for now, and hopefully we can get there. Okay, so I noticed that this hand, so this is the Cyberpunk 2077 with first-person shooter in mode. Watch the reload hand right here. You get a fair number of glitches on this reload hand. I did not notice it until I went through and reviewed it after the fact. So I think that's, like, do you see those glitches? Right around the edges of the fingers and hand. I'll try to pause on it so you can see, but that's an example of the frame generation. See right here? Right here, these little edge glitches along the fingers and hand. And you just don't get those on the right side that has no frame generation. Michael asks, have you decided on the #1 laptop that you're going to use for your personal use? I know other reviews are pending. I haven't officially, but I'm leaning towards the Blade 18 right now. I've got the GE78HX out there. I need to test that. And I also kind of want to test the Legion and the Scar 16 as well. Because that might end up being the one I end up going with. But overall, like, playing Cyberpunk still feels good. To me, it still feels better than not having it enabled, because we go from 75 FPS with a 57% 57 FPS 1% low, up to 114 FPS with an 89 FPS 1% low. And that is a massive increase to smoothness. So overall, I just feel like it's worth it. I feel like it's worth having the frame generation and increasing the latency as long as it's not a competitive title. That's really the key, in my opinion. If it's a competitive title where you're trying to outshoot someone or outreact to someone else, that's when you don't use it. But when it's basically almost everything else, almost all the other titles, everything that's single player, everything that's more casual oriented, as long as it's implemented well, frame generation is nothing but a positive, in my opinion. That's my current take on it. I'm going to need to test more games. I know maybe my opinion will change over time, but it really comes down to if it's implemented well and it's a non-competitive game, I'm pretty much going to probably be using frame generation all the time. So that's, I don't know, chat, what do you think? Am I crazy? Also, since it's AI, will it learn to get better? Yeah, some of those artifacts, like in the hand, it could get better and better over time. Especially that comes down to also dev optimization. Like, did they run the UIs through the AI engine? Or maybe are they going to render, maybe they need to render the actual game separately than the UI. And maybe there's a way to implement that inside of how the game engine renders with frame generation versus without frame generation. I don't know. So, some of these games may not be able to implement those kinds of changes without the game being rebuilt from the ground up. And so I anticipate frame generation to have less and less artifacting and problems as developers use frame generation and build games from the ground up featuring frame generation. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. And I do think frame generation is going to be used in most non-competitive games going forward, like for the foreseeable future, unless there's some other reason to not include frame generation. I just think it's gonna be a feature that most developers are gonna want to take advantage of, and most gamers are gonna want, because it's like, sweet, another 50% to 90% FPS boost. I'll take it. So, have you tried lowering the wattage and using frame generation? So Halo Blacktops, we did use frame generation on the MSI Katana, which is an 85 watt RTX 4070. You can check my live stream from yesterday if you want to check out the results. But we saw some impressive gains on the Hogwarts, going from 35 FPS up to 65 FPS inside of Hogsmeade. So it brought the game from being unplayable to playable. Yeah. Any idea when the Scar 18 will be available on Amazon? I think it's going to be going out of stock. I think Scar 18 is probably going to be selling out nonstop for a little while here. It'll probably become more widely available in 2 months, it'd be my guess. Within 2 months, somewhere in there. It might be as long as 4 to 6 months, but it'll be more and more available as the year goes on. So yeah, if you want to make sure that you can get a laptop that's in stock, then I would recommend being sure to check out my gaming laptop list, which I've talked about a bunch of times, but there's a link in the description down below. It'll help you figure out when laptops come in stock, and you can follow that list for daily sheet updates as well. So, I mean, this is my I guess summary of frame generation. It seems to be a very useful feature in all gaming aside from competitive games. So even single-player shooter games can benefit from it. That said, if a shooter game can have hit high enough frames per second without frame generation, then I would probably turn it off to decrease the overall latency. But if I'm struggling to hit high FPS in a shooter game like Cyberpunk, then I think I would probably rather have frame generation on, slightly increasing the FPS or slightly increasing the latency to have massive improvements to my frame rate. Yeah, that's my current take on frame gen. And I reserve the right to change my opinion, just like anyone. I think, but I'm a fan. I think NVIDIA is going to really kick AMD's teeth in until AMD can compete with their own feature set that's similar. So we'll have to see. So hey Gizmo, I got a 18 Predator Helios 18. Nice. Ooh, hey, send it to me so I can unbox it. Okay, so that's basically my summary of is frame generation worth it or not. I think in general it is, as long as it's not a competitive game. So we're going to end the live stream for now right here, but be sure to come back and be sure to subscribe for more future live streams. We're going to talk about the, we're going to do a live benchmarking for the MSI GT77, I think tomorrow. I'm going to keep pumping out these live streams. My goal is to do a live stream every day, except the days that I take off, maybe like 1 or 2 days on the weekend. Some days I'm not going to be able to do it because I have other stuff that I'm working on. But it's fun. I enjoy live streaming, and I enjoy interacting with you guys, being able to answer questions. It helps keep my perspective open and thinking about things from different angles, especially since I can try to get your questions in the middle of making the content. So I hope you guys enjoy the live streams. And yeah,